Hi, welcome to Session 5, Part 2, History 3380, World Civilizations. In Part 1 of Session 5, I was talking about trading empires, and we're going to continue to do that today. I talked in general about the fact that trading empires arose from a number of factors, including the conquest of sedentary populations by nomadic groups, the uses of, or increasing use of, certain technologies that improved long distance, especially ocean-going transportation, and more effective tools of war, and the fact that these new empires that combined both the assets of warrior states and sedentary populations focused on increasing their control over long-distance trade routes as a way of rapidly increasing their revenues and therefore their ability to expand. And we looked at a couple of specific examples last time with the Habsburgs and the Ottomans and their struggle over the Mediterranean. Today we're going to continue in that vein, looking at several other trading empires, particularly the Mughals, the Portuguese, the British, and finally the Chinese. But we're also going to do something else along the way, particularly as I get to the British, and something we'll pick up in the next session. And that is looking at some of the effects of trading empires. In this case, we're going to look specifically at the fur trade in North America and how certain indigenous populations were dramatically altered by their participation in the fur trade, which is a direct outgrowth of the rise of the trading empires. First of all, we're going to look at the Mughal Empire in India. And if we go to the first slide, I've got a map here, which will look somewhat familiar because I used it before. This is just a little bit larger. And this is essentially, you can see the Mughal Empire here, which is roughly the northern two-thirds of modern-day India and Pakistan, this entire area along here. In some important places are Gujarat, one of the major trading outposts in the empire. Goa, not so much for the Mughal Empire, but we're going to talk about Goa in relationship to the Portuguese Empire because it will establish an outpost here. And also other places that became major trading centers like Calcutta, Surat, along the coast of what is now modern-day India. And the significance of India in particular was, again, location. The great trading routes are coming from China and through the Spice Islands, through the Straits of Malacca, on to India, and then on into the Middle East and Europe. So India was perfectly situated to participate in a significant way in this kind of trade, and that's what the Mughal Empire was able to take advantage of. Now, India had long had a history of fractured political rule. Given its rugged terrain, the fact that it would be difficult for any single power to control vast territories in the Indian subcontinent over long periods, it had been difficult to organize a large-scale, long-term, centralized empire. There had been a couple, but they hadn't lasted that long, nor had they been that extensive. The Mughals would be the exception to that. Before their coming, India was largely dominated by a vast array of smaller principalities, and the one significant state in the north was the Sultanate of Delhi. This fracturing of the political system that had been a principal characteristic of the Indian subcontinent for centuries changed with the coming of the Mughals, and particularly their leader Babur. He is the one who led the Mughals in an invasion of India in 1528. The Mughals are basically related to the larger Mongol movement that spread across the Eurasian continent. They themselves were Muslims, and they brought their warrior talents to the region and were able to spread their control rapidly over the northern third and then the northern two-thirds of the Indian subcontinent. Among the most distinguished leaders after Babur, who led the conquest, was Akbar, who we've talked about a little bit in a past context in regards to religion. Not only did he rule over an even more extensive empire, he was also responsible for capturing the maritime outlet of Gujarat, and this was an important part in the development of the Mughal Empire because the more that it participated in the long-distance trade routes running across the Indian Ocean, the more powerful the empire would become. So we have sort of a classic start to a trading empire. the same kind of thing that we've seen elsewhere, with nomadic peoples invading a more sedentary population, using their warrior skills combined with the administrative skills of local sedentary urbanized groups, and creating this rapidly expanding trading empire that relies on both trade and warfare to increase its size and increase its influence. So the Mughals fit very much into the pattern that we've already seen elsewhere with the rise of these types of empires. Now, one of the important aspects of trade in the empire was the fact that it was private enterprise. I make this distinction because in a few minutes when we talk about some of the other empires, we will see an increasing attempt to control trade directly by the state. The Mughals were not interested in that kind of process. They were situated in a region where there was what I've described here on the slide as a magnificent marketplace. The Indian Ocean was teeming with tens of thousands of merchants, hundreds of thousands of sailors, thousands upon thousands of sailing vessels from an extraordinary array of backgrounds. People from China, from Southeast Asia, from India, from what we have called in the past Burma, from the Middle East, from the east coast of Africa, people of all different linguistic, ethnic, and religious backgrounds, all involved in this vast network of trade. Spices were an important part of that. I've talked about that before, but it wasn't the only product by any means. All kinds of other products were also being exchanged: silks, horses, various kinds of agricultural products, diamonds, emeralds, you name it. If it was a precious good, it was probably in play as a product of trade in the Indian Ocean. And what the Mughal Empire did was essentially follow the patterns of earlier trading empires and existing principalities and sultanates in the region. And that was to simply create a series of safe entrepôts, safe ports, maritime locations, where people of different backgrounds, Asian, European, etc., could come and exchange goods with a reasonable degree of security in return for paying a tariff or a tax of some kind. So the idea of the Mughals was, look at, everyone and anyone can come and trade in this port, that port, Gujarat, etc., as long as they pay us a little tribute to maintain the system. So it was essentially the more the merrier. They much preferred diversity. This was precisely how their trading empire flourished, was by tapping into the resources of these the multiplicity of trading groups that were involved in the Indian Ocean, providing a secure environment and then taxing those people who participate. Again, I stress this because we will see a very different situation with the coming of one of the European powers to the Indian Ocean and how they try to deal with this vast marketplace. However, if the Mughal Empire focused on diversity in its trading practices, diversity in terms of its population composition was a problem. The Mughals were Muslims. They had conquered a vast area and created an empire out of people who were primarily Hindu. And there would be ongoing tensions between the two groups. Now, typically, when you have an alien invader conquering a region, you're going to have tensions between conqueror and conquered. And in this case, where there's a fundamental religious and cultural difference, that division between conquered and conqueror is going to run along religious lines. Now, to manage an empire where there was often a threat of unrest, the Mughals developed an administrative system with two types of administrators. One group looked very much like the kinds of officials that the Ottomans had created with their Janissary Corps. The Mansabdars were primarily military leaders who had assisted in the conquest and assisted in the continued governance of the empire itself. And just like the Ottomans, the Mughals would reward these military figures by giving them the right to collect tribute in a certain area that they would control. Now, one difficulty that always arises with this kind of arrangement is that the ruler then has a problem of exactly how to deal with these appointed administrators. If he leaves them there for a long period, perhaps even generations, with one generation after another inheriting the position, there's the danger that that official, that mansabdar, will develop close ties to the local population and use that base of support to challenge the ruler for control. So you have the danger, if you leave these people in place too long, they will become effective rivals. On the other hand, you could move them around and reassign them so that that won't happen. The problem with that situation is that when officials like this are moved, what they tend to do is to exploit the local population to an extreme degree. Why? Because they never know what the next appointment is going to bring. Perhaps they're governing a prosperous region at the moment, but they could well be appointed next time to a far less prosperous region, meaning the tribute collections, which they share with the emperor, will not be as robust, and they'll make less money. So when they're first assigned somewhere, they exploit the local population to an extreme degree in order to get as much as possible, not knowing what might lie ahead. Over time, the emperors tended to try to move the mansabdars around. This didn't always work, depending on how strong the emperor was. The weaker emperors were less able to dislodge them and move them as they chose. So it varied, but generally that was the principle on which they functioned. On the other hand, there were another group of administrators, zamindars, who were Hindu princes. These were people who already were prominent figures in the region. They were often the leaders of castes in the local regions, and they had held power, or their ancestors, before the Mughals ever came. Now, these people often survived in place because the Mughals would make deals. Rather than simply conquering every region, as we saw again with the Ottomans, it was a common technique, you cut a deal with the local ruler. That the local ruler, the local zamindar, can stay in power in return for collecting tribute for the emperor and ruling on behalf of the emperor. So we have essentially a second group of administrators who are Hindus and whose power is rooted in the region itself. The reason they have power is because they are from the region. They are the leader of or a prominent member of a local caste. You can't move them around. Their power comes from the fact that they are native to the region which they are administering. The importance of this over time was that it would create problems for the empire. We'll get to this later in the course, in that the zamindars found it much easier to appeal to the local population. They were not going to drive exploitation of the population to any extreme because, of course, they had nowhere else to go. They couldn't afford to do that. They were rooted in this region. On the other hand, the mansabdars often have reason to exploit the local population to the maximum level. So we're going to have two rival groups of administrators and one group that tends to have an advantageous position in terms of gaining popular support. Over the long term, that would be a critical weakness in the empire that would eventually undermine its authority. Meanwhile, we want to look at the first European power to come to this vast marketplace, and that's Portugal. And in doing that, again, you've seen this map before, but I want to go back to it because it illustrates, or we can illustrate on it, the growth of the Portuguese and their trading empire. Because what the Portuguese did, starting from their own western base, was to move down the coast of Africa and eventually all the way to the coast of East Africa into the Middle East, all the way up to here. This is the Strait of Hormuz up here. On to India. Goa, I mentioned before, down here, became another outpost for the Portuguese. On to the Straits of Malacca, where they established another outpost, and eventually all the way to China. Now, this was not a land-based empire. This is not a vast holding. They don't conquer Africa or the Middle East or India. They had no power to do so. What they were doing was establishing a series of trading outposts along the coastal regions, which they could connect back to the homeland to conduct trade over this vast stretch of water. And that's precisely what they would do. But as we will see, unlike what the Mughal Empire did, their interest was not in simply, well, let's go engage in free trade. Everyone else is involved in trade there. We'll do the same thing. Not by a long shot. They had a very different approach to tying this vast trading network together. Now, the Portuguese didn't have a terrific base from which to begin. Their population wasn't very large, about 1 million people. They didn't have a great deal of excellent agricultural land. In fact, they even had a scarcity of trees. Very soon after they created their empire, they began building many of their ships for their empire in India because of a lack of sufficient lumber in Portugal itself. One thing they did have, though, was that they were one of the first so-called warrior states of Europe to create a centralized dynastic power, the House of Aviz, which established its authority by 1147 in its capital of Lisbon. The importance of this is that it gives them a big head start. Remember, the Spanish aren't going to create a consolidated dynasty until the 15th century. They're hundreds of years ahead of everybody, including the British, who were even further behind than the Spanish were. And having a centralized dynasty is almost essential if you're going to create a trading empire. Private interests aren't going to take on this big job of exploring and establishing and protecting these trade routes. You need a central political authority with a good deal of resources who will back such enterprises and see that they succeed. And that was the big advantage that the Portuguese had. In addition, of course, they had long been a nation that made part of its wealth from the sea, with fishing. Means they had a number of experienced sailors, and they quickly began to study ocean currents, wind currents, to learn how to properly navigate over long distances. And what they did in a series of movements, this sort of breaks it down for you in terms of chronology and specifics. They reached the bulge of Africa by 1469, meaning the great hump of Africa. They reached the Congo River, which is south-central Africa. The explorer Diego Cao gets there by 1481, and there establishes close ties with what was a major trading empire in Africa, the Kingdom of the Congo, for a specific purpose. And again, we'll come back and look at this more closely later on, and that was to create ties for the purposes of the slave trade. The Portuguese had been establishing sugar plantations on islands in the South Atlantic, and they needed slave populations to work those plantations. So a major driving force as they established trading outposts along the coast of Africa is to tap into Africa's population to secure slaves to utilize on their plantations in the South Atlantic. Very soon, across the Atlantic in the Americas, vast areas are going to be opened up for exploitation in South America, the Caribbean. We talked about the development of Afro-Creole populations after the demographic disaster in the Caribbean, and millions upon millions of Africans will be taken to the Western Hemisphere to work as slaves, but that was to come later. Initially, the slave trade is relatively small because the needs of the market to man these plantations is relatively small. The key for the Portuguese, what they were most interested in, was the spice trade. The spice trade, by the time the Portuguese began exploring down the coast of Africa in the 15th century, in the 1400s. The spice trade was probably already at least 1,000 years old. Probably for 1,000 years. Spices had been transported from the Spice Islands, essentially islands in what is now Indonesia, across the Indian Ocean to India itself. Gujarat became a major outpost. Then on to the Middle East, and finally into the Eastern Mediterranean. Spices like cloves, pepper, etc. had been a part of this trade for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it was engaged in by a multiplicity of mercantile interests and political entities. And again, long-distance trade didn't mean that one merchant carried spices all the way from the Spice Islands to India and then on to the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean. These were goods that were exchanged at various points along the way, the ultimate destination being either the Middle East or the Eastern Mediterranean. That means, of course, Europe. And this was all done largely in a very open way because, of course, the individual sultanates and principalities and city-states and even the Mughal Empire as it developed, all of them were interested in maintaining free trade and simply taxing the trade itself. Portuguese had a different idea. Alfonso de Albuquerque, a Portuguese nobleman, sailor, entered the Indian Ocean in 1500 with the idea of expanding Portuguese interests. He initiated a strategy which the Portuguese would continue to pursue for the next 100 years or so. And that is to conquer or control a series of choke points along the trade route for spices. Three in particular: Goa in India, Malacca, which is on the Straits of Malacca in 1511, and Hormuz, the Straits of Hormuz, in 1515. Now, we'll come back to that slide in a second. But here again, you've got Malacca here, you've got Goa here, and here are the Straits of Hormuz. 3 points along the way, especially this one and this one, involving narrow waterways where it's relatively easy to control the trade. In other words, to use military force to interdict the trading vessels of other political entities, other groups. That was the plan of the Portuguese. They wanted literally to monopolize the trade, to prevent anyone except the Portuguese or someone authorized by them from conducting the spice trade. A radical divergence from the way the trade had been conducted in the Indian Ocean for hundreds and hundreds of years. So this represents a dramatic shift from the past. The other approach that they took in goods other than spices, especially off the coast of India, was to engage in establishing a licensing system. What that meant was that the Portuguese would declare that any ship traveling in the waters off the coast of India, let us say, on the west coast of India, had to secure a license from the Portuguese government, from local Portuguese officials, in order to engage in trade in the region. If a Portuguese naval vessel boarded you and you didn't have the necessary license, your goods would be seized, you'd lose everything. Now, what gave the Portuguese the authority to do this? Nothing. They just did it. You know, it's basically a form of quasi-legal robbery. You're just saying, wait, we have the right to control this. You're out of luck unless you have one of our licenses. Both of these tactics, the choke points and the licenses, were designed essentially to try to monopolize the trade of the Indian Ocean by the Portuguese. Would they ever succeed in doing that? No, for a couple of reasons. One, they really didn't have the kind of vast naval power it would take to control these huge stretches of ocean, even if they could control choke points at a certain period. Secondly, although their monopoly was never 100% effective, they did manage to drive up the price of spices, which are already expensive. What that did was trigger a huge amount of smuggling within the Portuguese system. The Portuguese themselves did a huge amount of smuggling within their own system to make money. Merchants, captains of vessels, ordinary sailors, all engaged in smuggling because there was a very lucrative trade to be had if you could ship spices in and avoid the official monopoly. Another reason why it wouldn't work is that the Ottoman Empire was also very interested in the spice trade, although it was more interested in simply taxing the trade. The Ottomans were not about to let the Portuguese just move into the Indian Ocean and start running things the way they wanted. So they would periodically attack the Portuguese. So aside from the limits of their own naval power, the rapid increase in smuggling that occurred as they tried to create this monopoly, there was also the constant challenge coming from the Ottoman Empire. So we have two major trading empires, one making sure that the other is not going to monopolize the trade in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese would go on trying to do this, and as I said, they managed to drive up prices for spices in Europe because they did, to some degree, restrict the trade in spices. But nevertheless, they never could completely monopolize the trade, even though they made a lot of money out of trying to monopolize it. But again, it's a radical shift from the past in the Indian Ocean and even what other trading empires have been doing up to now, such as the Ottomans and the Mughals, who were more content to simply tax trade rather than try to directly control it and create monopolies. And this will be one of the things that has a powerful impact in succeeding centuries, because other trading empires, as we will see, will follow a similar course. They're going to try to monopolize certain kinds of trade or certain trade routes. And when they do that, they're going to create all kinds of conflict and set off other types of changes. But we'll come back to that. Now, another European power who we always think of as one of the great imperial powers and trading powers of the world was England. But England was actually a late starter in this whole process. By the time the British got around to long-distance trade and exploration, the Habsburgs had been around, the Ottomans, the Mughals, the Portuguese. There were already, and of course the Chinese, who we'll talk about later, been around even longer than that. There were already a whole series of trading empires that were well established by the time the British got into the fray. When we look at what was going on in England at the time that the Spanish are conquering the New World and the Portuguese have already gone as far as India and are establishing their choke points along the trade route of spices, England's involved in a struggle over religious practice, with Henry VIII instituting the Protestant Reformation in England in 1533, and then succeeding struggles over who would actually succeed Henry, eventually coming down to his daughter Elizabeth. So England was still in turmoil in these years. Henry helped set the dynasty on a course of creating a strong centralized authority, but by the time he did that in the 1530s, other powers were way ahead of England. The thing that did give England considerable prosperity at this time was the wool trade. England was exporting large amounts of wool to the European continent for manufacture of textiles, and this trade proved to be particularly lucrative for the British. So they do have a prosperous economy at this time. But again, they're starting from way behind. One striking example of this is when Sir Francis Drake finally circumnavigates the globe, in other words, sails all the way around the world. The Portuguese sailor, Ferdinand Magellan, who was actually working for the Spanish, had essentially succeeded in doing the same thing 60 years earlier. The British are finally settling Jamestown in 1607. The Spanish had left their first settlements in the Americas as early as 1492. So they're a bit behind. So they had to play catch-up. They're a late starter. They're at least 100 years behind everybody else. But they will succeed over the next couple of centuries in displacing all their competitors and coming to dominate the world as the world's leading trading power. Okay, so how do they manage to do all of that? One thing was that they had a strong economy. As I said, the wool trade provided a lucrative trade, a lucrative source of revenue for merchants and for the state at this time. Something else that the British did to help consolidate that economy was to create a fixed currency in 1560. Now, this doesn't mean a fixed currency. Okay, so you got money and you said this is the British pound or whatever. This is extremely important. In the early modern world, currency was, well, not very current. There was all kinds of money floating around, different forms of money. When you talk about pieces of 8, well, what the Spanish had done, the way they created smaller currency was to take a gold coin and cut it into 8 pieces. That's the way you make that's the way you make change. Even then, money was in short supply. Almost any country that you went to in the world in the 1500s, very few people would have money. Partly because it was unreliable. It was easy to counterfeit. And partly because there was a general lack of species and governments had done very little to create stable currencies. So when the British do this in 1560, when they create an official currency and they fix its value, it's a major step forward in economic development because now you've got a medium of exchange that people can rely on, that's standardized, something that had rarely existed in the past. Another event that moves England towards a rapidly expanding economy was civil war that broke out in 1639 and ended in 1642 with the execution of Charles I, the King of England at that time. We're not going to get into the details of the Civil War. The important part of it is that the English Civil War brought to prominence and to an influential position in the state commercial interests, both landowners who wanted to develop land in a new way to get rid of the old feudal system and move towards something that we now call capitalism, and merchants who were anxious to expand England's commercial system internationally. So both landowning groups and merchant groups with aggressive strategies for growth gained influence as a result of the Civil War. So England may remain and would return to being a monarchy, but it would be a monarchy heavily influenced by groups that wanted to see rapid international economic growth. Another step in this direction was the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694, which provided an established institution overseeing currency, overseeing finances in the country. Again, a centralized government authority that had significant influence over how the economy functioned. Extremely important, again, for the development of the English economy, and in many ways far advanced beyond what other trading empires like the Portuguese and the Ottomans had achieved at that time. Now, at the same time, the British are inclined, as the Portuguese, to try to seek monopolistic opportunities when they can. And in 1600, they created the British East India Company, which was to have exclusive trading rights with territories in the Indian Ocean. However, this monopoly was not aimed at other trading empires. The monopoly was aimed at British merchants. The British East India Company is essentially a joint stock company. It's a company where people buy shares, not very many people, a few powerful merchants. They invest in the company. It's a dynamic new kind of economic institution, a joint stock company. Something we take for granted today. We call it a corporation now, public corporation. It was going to have the monopoly. It would exclude other British merchants. but it would give the British a dynamic instrument to use as they moved into the Indian Ocean and sought to expand their trade there. One of the things that drives the British initially as they seek to expand through the Atlantic Ocean and on into the Indian Ocean is something that also influenced the Portuguese, of course, and that is the slave trade. And again, we're going to come back and talk about the slave trade in more detail later on, but it becomes an important element in the growth of British trade, the fact that they managed the purchase and sale of hundreds of thousands of human beings. This is one way the British trade expansion is financed in this period. Now, when they do get to the Indian Ocean, they're again latecomers. After all, the Portuguese had gotten there more than 130 years sooner. And even after the Portuguese, the Dutch had showed up. So the British are a bit late on the scene. And they realized that there are other major powers, never mind the Mughal Empire, which is very powerful, and the Ottoman Empire, but there are already other major European powers, the Dutch and the Portuguese, who have established major trade routes in the region. So the British go about rather quietly creating their own outposts. But these are not meant to be choke points. They establish or gain the right to establish trading outposts in 3 cities on the Indian subcontinent: Surat, Madras, and Calcutta. But they're not seeking monopoly privileges. The Portuguese, when they arrived, would open fire on a local port with their cannon and then say, okay, now we want trade, okay? You give us trade monopoly. The British would come and say, if you don't mind, we would like to be all of these thousands of other traders in the Mughal Empire who have come and gone in the past. We would like to be like them if you'd be so kind to allow us to trade in these areas, and we'll pay our tax or tribute to the emperor. Fine. So they begin on a much quieter scale in the Indian Ocean. They have to, because they're latecomers. They really can't shove aside the Portuguese and the Dutch when they first get started. But over time, their power will grow. Meanwhile, the other side of the world was a different story. In the Western Hemisphere, in North America, the British had established a series of colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America, 13 of which, of course, later became the United States. Now, admittedly, when the British looked out from London around the world, let us say 1650 or so, they were certain that their most important trade opportunities lay in the Indian Ocean. On the other side of the Atlantic was a series of colonies, but they weren't nearly as important economically, certainly not at this time, as were the trade opportunities in the Indian Ocean. Nevertheless, their advantage, the advantage for the British in those colonies across the Atlantic, was that they controlled those colonies, and they could there dictate the kind of monopoly trade that the Portuguese and other powers had sought in the Indian Ocean. For the American colonies, the British are going to create just the kind of monopolistic closed trading system that the Portuguese hoped that they could create in the Indian Ocean, though they never succeeded. Typical of what the British did with the Navigation Acts in 1660, which said goods can be transported in colonial trade only in English ships. In other words, if goods are going to be sent into the colonies, if goods are going to be taken out of the colonies, either way they have to travel in English vessels. One way of excluding foreigners, because obviously foreign merchants, whether they're French or Dutch or whomever, and they were 2 of the major trading rivals of the British in the Atlantic, Dutch and French traders are not going to be operating British vessels. They wouldn't be allowed to. So it was one way of excluding these other powers in the trade with the American colonies. Another restriction was the establishment of enumerated goods. Certain goods, such as tobacco, indigo, which is a dye, which could only be sent to England or another colonial port. So if in Virginia you're producing tobacco and you want to export it, there are only two areas you can export it to, either one of the other American colonies or back to England. That's what the enumerated goods are about. It's another way of limiting what people can do with their products, ensuring that the American colonies are only going to trade with England. The Staples Act of 1663 put further restrictions. If goods are being transshipped, are being shipped in or being imported and coming from any place but England, they have to be transshipped through England. In other words, let's make it simple. An English merchant decides he wants to buy French wine and send it to the American colonies. Now, does anybody drink English wine? Is there English wine? Got to get French wine. Okay? So I have an English vessel, so it's okay. I'm covered, despite the Navigation Acts. But what they're telling me now is, once I get the French wine in a French port, I can't go directly to the American colonies, even though I'm sailing a British vessel. I have to stop in England first. And what that means is when I go in, they hit me with an import duty, and when I leave, they hit me with an export duty. The end result is, by the time I get through transshipping the product through England, my product costs a fortune. It's prohibitively expensive. It's not worth doing. So the Staples Act was just another way of prohibiting foreign goods from being shipped into the American colonies. The Navigation Act of 1673 established a plantation duty. That was a tax on plantation products, like tobacco, indigo, eventually cotton. Any crop that was being grown in large amounts commercially for international trade had to pay a special tax. The whole purpose of all of these plantation duties, enumerated goods, navigation acts was simply to create a closed system where the American colonies can only trade with England and where England will extract the maximum benefit from that trade. The colonies were to produce agricultural products, raw materials that the English economy could use, and England would sell manufactured goods like glass and hardware to the American colonies. Along the way, because of the closed system, the American colonists would have to accept prices for their goods dictated by British merchants. This is not a free trade system. They don't have any choice. They can only sell it in England, basically, so they'll have to accept whatever price the English merchants are willing to pay. There are no competitors. French merchants, Dutch merchants, they can't compete under this system. So this is a closed network designed to profit the mother country at the expense of the colonies. The exploitation of the colonies, of course, would become a major issue in the American Revolution. But that was the way systems were constructed at the time. But again, although the British can't set up a monopoly or even attempt to do that in the Indian Ocean the way the Portuguese at least attempted to, when it comes to the Atlantic Ocean and their Atlantic colonies where they have control, they are going to do precisely that. They're going to create a monopolized trade system that will benefit the mother country itself at the expense of the colonies. Now, in looking at what the British did in North America, I want to stop for a minute and talk about effects of these trading empires. We're seeing now how the European systems, particularly the Portuguese and the British, we could have included the Dutch, because they did the same thing in the Indian Ocean, are geared towards creating monopolistic systems. And of course, what this is designed to do is to benefit the mother country at the expense of other societies. But in addition to that, the expansion in long-distance trade had a variety of other consequences, not necessarily intended by anyone. And we're going to look at one of these today, and then when we get to Spain next time, we'll start talking about the Spanish Empire in detail, of how one trading empire functioned. We're going to look at other consequences beyond this. But this is just one example of what happens in terms of dramatic changes in society that can be brought about by this early stage of globalization. One of the products that was in high demand in Europe, coming from North America, was fur. And to secure fur, specifically from beavers, the British, as well as the French, would trade with the Native American populations of North America, who would actually do the hunting or trapping, and who would then trade those goods for European products being brought in. The trade routes that were followed essentially ran along the St. Lawrence Seaway through the Great Lakes and then eventually on into the Great Northwest. There was another route that came up the Hudson River along this direction, but these are the two main routes, and essentially they followed this northerly then westerly course across North America as Europeans moved westward and sought trading relationships with a variety of Native American populations. Now, again, what's happening here is just a simple exchange of goods, apparently. The Europeans want the fur of the beavers, and what they're looking for is a soft felt. If you look at if you've seen a beaver, I mean, it doesn't look like the kind of fur you'd want to make into a coat, because the thing is, just got all these bristles on it. But right near the surface of the skin is this soft felt material that you can take and turn into hats and other forms of sophisticated dress. And this kind of product was extremely important back in the 17th and 18th centuries because people's dress distinguished their class position, their social rank, whether they were members of the nobility, etc. It wasn't just, well, gee, I'm wearing the latest fashion, I'm wearing Nike sneakers. It's that, look at, my clothes tell you that I'm a member of the nobility, I'm a wealthy merchant, and one of the things that did that were clothes made out of fur, especially hats, but also coats and other such products. So there's a huge demand, and this is basically a luxury good trade. But again, it's just a trade, apparently. We give you the fur, you give us things like hatchets and knives, manufactured metal products. That's what the Native Americans get in return. But it was far more than that. The effects were far greater than just an exchange of goods. One group of Native Americans that's quickly affected by the fur trade were the Abenaki. The Abenaki lived in various parts of what is now New England, the New England states of the United States. Their conventional behavior patterns and economic activities centered around group actions and such areas as fishing, agriculture, and hunting for game. And in fact, the group social organization, in other words, working together as extended families, kin groups that we talked about before, those were ideally suited to the kinds of economic activities the Abenaki were involved in. For example, to catch fish, what you do is you stretch a net across a stream or a river mouth, and you pull the net forward and gather the fish as they're moving up or down the riverbed. To do that, you need a number of people working together. So it's a group activity. Agriculture is dealt with in the same way. So is hunting. About hunting, one of the ways you do this is you send in a couple of people who scare the game, create noise, so they drive the game forward, and then you have hunters waiting at a clearing, and when the animals, deer or whatever, enter, they fire arrows, etc., and kill the game. So you do it as a group. But when the opportunities of the fur trade came along, the fur trade was much more individualistic. What you do is you go out and lay a series of traps, and then you work your way back along the trap line, gathering up the animals that have been caught in the traps. You don't need 10 people. You don't need 5 people. 2 is probably plenty. So it's a much more individualistic enterprise. You don't act in concert with a group of people. You act usually as an individual and maybe with another member of your family. So what happens over time, and this is a matter of a few decades, you get an individualization of Abenaki culture. People are operating much more as individuals than they are as groups because of the kind of economic activity they're engaged in. And how did this change come about? Because they got linked up with long-distance trade routes, with a part of early modern globalization. The other thing it did was it slaughtered most of the Abenaki. Why? Because the Europeans were bearing disease, just as with their cousins to the south, Mexico, the Caribbean, South America, the Abenaki too were part of this isolated human gene pool that had very little resistance to European diseases. So those indigenous groups who had the most contact with the Europeans showing up were the ones who were going to suffer the highest death rates. And that's just what happened, of course, because the fur trade would involve a lot of exchanges with Europeans. And the more contact and the closer contact you have with the Europeans, the more likely you are to be exposed to diseases like smallpox. And very quickly, the Abenaki were reduced from a population of maybe 10,000. Within a few decades, they were reduced to a population of about 2,000 or less. So we have both a dramatic social change and a drastic demographic change, both of them coming from a seemingly innocuous exchange of goods, of beaver fur for some European hardware and glass. Now, a second, even more profound set of changes occurred for another indigenous group, the Dakotas. The Dakotas were living along the banks of the Great Lakes at the time of the beginnings of the fur trade. And they were essentially an agricultural people, as we will see. But their sedentary life was going to be disrupted because Europeans seeking more rapid access to the fur trade were going to be penetrating the Great Lakes area from the north. If we go back to this map, here are the Great Lakes, and just north of here is Hudson's Bay, a vast bay in what's now modern-day Canada. The Hudson's Bay Company was going to use Hudson's Bay as a way of coming down this way. Instead of taking the long route here, they were going to come down this way into the western regions of the Great Lakes in order to trade for fur. Now, there are always rival groups of Native American tribes seeking to dominate the trade. And the Europeans, the European merchants coming, always wanted to establish one or two groups as the dominant ones with which they would work. That worked most easily for them. In this case, the Hudson's Bay Company armed one group, the Cree, with rifles and other weapons, which the Cree then used to drive the Dakotas out of the Great Lakes region. So the Dakotas are forced to migrate because of the coming of the Europeans and their desire to dominate the fur trade in the region. So this agricultural sedentary people is driven off as a direct result of the expanding fur trade. Now, the Dakotas had relied on agricultural products, and they were a fairly rigid hierarchical society. What that meant was that rulership within the tribe and the subgroups within it was inherited from one generation to the next. Certain families dominated They were believed to have special religious powers, special connections with the gods. And as a result, it was their heirs who consistently controlled power in Dakota society. But now, with the coming of the Cree and their weapons, the Dakotas were going to have to adapt. First of all, they're going to have to run for their lives. But secondly, they were going to have to find a way to survive. They wind up in the Great Plains of North America. And in the process of adaptation, they merge two technologies that have been brought from Western Europe. One, an animal technology, the horse. There were no horses in the Western Hemisphere before the Europeans came. And there were virtually no beasts of burden. And the best that you could do in the Americas for a beast of burden was a llama. Okay? And a llama is about half the size of, let's say, a normal-sized draft horse, etc. And besides that, llamas are gifted with really bad attitudes. If you try to put any great burden on them, they'll either spit at you or kick you, and they're quite good at both. In fact, that's why they're used as actually guard animals now. Sheep herders in the United States have used llamas to protect their herds because they'll kick the hell out of a wolf or tries to approach their herd. They're really mean creatures. So in any case, Native Americans really didn't have any access to beasts of burden. And then the Spanish show up. They conquer the Aztecs in Mexico. In the process, horses are either stolen by Native Americans, they escape from the Spanish, but very quickly we have large numbers of horses being reproduced in Mexico and then migrating north. And as those horses appear in more northern latitudes, various Native American groups adopt their use. One of the groups that would do that were the Dakotas. What they did that was distinctive was that they merged their use of horses with the use of rifles, again brought from Europe. They became not only exceptional horsemen, but they became expert marksmen and could practice that marksmanship even as they were racing along on the back of one of their animals. So, having been driven out by the fur trade, they now adapted by adopting certain technologies that had been introduced into their general environment. And they then used those technologies specifically to hunt buffalo. Now, of course, when you read about American history and you read about Native Americans and you read about the Dakotas, there's always talk about these, Plains Indians and their nomadic culture, which is true, because the Dakotas would move with the buffalo. And when the buffalo went into winter quarters, so would the Dakotas. Then when spring came, they would begin to follow the buffalo herds once again, hunting them. And they became a nomadic people, instead of being the sedentary agricultural people that they had once been. Furthermore, they developed a direct link back to the fur trade, which had originally displaced them. Aside from the fact that, yes, they used the buffalo for clothing, using its fur, skins, and also to create teepees, etc. But another thing they did was to take the buffalo meat, cut it up into strips, and dry it, and treat it with berries and other natural products to create what's called pemmican. It's also known as beef jerky. In fact, one of the brands calls itself pemmican. That's what beef jerky is. It's dried beef. The importance of this is that there was a market for pemmican among fur trappers. The people who were trapping beaver had a need for this product. Why? Because they were engaged in something that we now consider an important part of modern economies, specialization of function. In other words, when you're a fur trapper, you don't want to be out in the woods and have to stop every couple of days and go hunting for a rabbit or, a deer or something, and then cutting it up and cooking it. And you can't afford to pile 500 pounds of, canned food, not that cans, but, sacks of food on your back and go slogging through the woods. What you need, is sort of a 17th century version of an energy bar. And that's what pemmican was. It was loaded with protein. So a relatively small amount can sustain you. And you can then specialize in your main function, which is trapping beaver. So the Dakotas wound up feeding into the economic needs of the same fur trade that had driven them off in the first place. Along the way, their society had changed. Not only was it no longer sedentary agricultural society that had become a nomadic society, but it had become a society with far more social mobility. Now, the important people were not those who could claim descent from earlier generations within distinguished families. They were the hunters and warriors. Those were the people that rose to prominence. Males who could distinguish themselves as hunters and warriors, fighting on horseback, hunting on horseback, acquiring more and more horses. That was a key sign of status. These were the people that rose to the top. They became the chiefs. So now we have a society where it's a matter of meritocracy. In other words, it's your performance as a hunter, not your birth, which determines your social status. So here's a society that's undergone profound changes because of the coming of the fur trade, the comings of what we might call early globalization to North America. And it also illustrates the incredible adaptability of human beings, how they can radically change their own culture, their own society, when the need arises. Now, one other example of what happens with the fur trade is that, well, relations were relatively peaceful early on. They had to be in order for this to work. There was a good deal of warfare, but it was usually one Native American group attacking another in order to stake its claim to the fur trade in a particular region. There was relatively little conflict between the European traders and the Native American groups. But that was going to change. For one thing, after a while, it wasn't just a few Europeans coming along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes and the Hudson River to trade for furs. More and more people were coming to settle. And they were coming in ever greater numbers. And it was clear that they weren't going away. This was not a temporary situation. So the Europeans are starting to infringe on the lands of the indigenous populations. Something else that happens that's critical is that many tribal groups didn't actually hunt beaver directly. What they did is serve as middlemen. They served the Iroquois, for example, the Ottawa. These are two examples of indigenous groups that didn't actually do the hunting. Instead, they were the middlemen, taking goods from the Europeans and exchanging those goods with other groups that actually did the hunting for the fur, then exchanging the fur back to the Europeans. But what began to happen over time by the 18th century is the Europeans began to circumvent those Native American groups that had been the middlemen. These changes start to create crises in the indigenous societies in North America. They're losing their role in what has become a very important economic activity, the fur trade. And increasingly, it's apparent the Europeans are coming and they're not going away. And they're infringing on the territories of the local tribes. As a result of this, societies under stress often turn towards messianic movements, to the belief that there is going to come a savior who will reverse the course of history and restore these people to their rightful position. That happened among the Ottawa, the belief in the master of life who would drive off the Europeans. Pontiac's rebellion, the rise of the Ottawa led by their chief Pontiac in a series of attacks on British settlements, was a direct outgrowth of these changes, of the Native Americans seeing the Europeans infringing on their position and seeing their economic position undermined as the Europeans circumvented them and went directly to the trappers to secure their furs. Under these pressures, the Ottawa rebelled in a desperate effort to reverse the course of events, a desperate and unsuccessful effort. So here is another dramatic set of changes that come about as a result of trade. It's just trade, but it can bring on dramatic change. So globalization and dramatic changes in societies is not really new. We see it back in the 17th and 18th centuries in North America. Now, one other trading empire that we're going to look at is China. And I leave China last, even though if we looked at the world in 1500, we would say it's the most important trading empire in the world, because it was the biggest, most powerful economy in the world. But it was on a different trajectory than all those other empires as of 1500. Now, we've talked about China a bit already. The long string of imperial dynasties, the development of trained bureaucrats, the scholarly gentries or the mandarins, giving succeeding dynasties extensive and stable control over a vast empire. And we also saw the breakdown of one such imperial system with the invasion of the Mongols, and eventually the displacement of the Mongols, partly undermined by the Black Death, who were in turn replaced by another authentic Chinese dynasty, the Ming. At the time of the early Ming Empire, the 13th century, 14th century, China's influence stretched into Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Indian Ocean. It was a vast trading network that China had influence over. And in the 1420s and 30s, a Chinese admiral named Zheng He sailed across the Western Pacific, down through the islands of the Indonesian archipelago, into the Indian Ocean, all the way to Africa, using hundreds of vessels, thousands of sailors. But unlike the voyages of the Portuguese explorers and other European explorers, this was not intended, nor did it result in the creation of a powerful trading empire in the Indian Ocean and in Eastern Africa. It was largely a demonstration of China's influence, but it didn't have lasting impact. You don't see the creation of a trading outpost as you see with the Portuguese or any kind of monopolistic system. China was starting to turn in upon itself. Part of the problem for the Chinese was that merchants, who should have been the critical and dynamic force here, actually enjoyed relatively low status within Chinese society. They had little influence over Chinese economic policy because they had little influence over the state itself. Merchants were considered on the same level as actors, which is about as low as you could get in Chinese society. Furthermore, the state had enormous power over trade and over all economic activities. In contrast with the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman Empire, China not only sought the payment of tribute, but to control trade very directly, very direct control by the state. At one point, the Ming ordered a cessation of all ocean-going trade, any kind of long-distance trade. The edict said not 1 inch of board is to enter the sea. In other words, no vessels are to sail off to engage in long-distance trade. This coming at a time when the other trading empires are just beginning their rapid expansion. When the Europeans begin arriving in the 1500s, the Chinese do everything they can to exclude and limit European trade. They limit European trade through one port, what the Europeans call Canton, what is in fact the Chinese port of Guangzhou. So here was a trading empire that was by far the most powerful in the world, if we look back at, let us say, 1300. And although by 1500, technically, it's still the biggest economy in the world, it is rapidly losing its dynamism. And it's rapidly going to face challenges from these other trading empires, such as the Portuguese, the British, the Dutch, who are seeking to expand their influence and their trade routes. The Chinese remain important because they represent this vast market. The biggest internal market in the world is still in China as of 1500. So everyone wants to come and sell goods there. But China is losing its dynamic. It is not expanding outward. It is becoming static. That isolation leads inevitably to decline. The Ming emperors isolated themselves from their own population. The mandarins, who were supposed to provide balanced bureaucratic rule at the local level, increasingly came under the control of the great landowners. What did that mean? It meant that the mandarins, who frequently controlled the legal process, ruled in favor of large landowners seeking to seize the land of peasants. So the rich were becoming ever more powerful because their control over the bureaucracy was growing. At the same time, China's population is beginning to expand by leaps and bounds. 100 million in 1600, 300 million in 1800. In 200 years, a tripling of the population. Something that is typical of the stagnation of this time is a lack of technological innovation. Land is being added that produces more food, that allows the society to sustain more people. But at a certain point, you're exhausting the available land, and you have to have new technologies, fertilizers, better machinery, in order to increase production. So the maintenance of this expanding population becomes a major crisis within Chinese society by 1800. So China is wrapped up in a series of internal crises, just as the great empires are expanding. So China is the exception in the empires we've looked at because, while the others are all growing and expansive by 1500, China has become static, has gone into isolation, and has entered a long-term period of decline. What we've looked at in this session is the rise of the trading empires. Nomadic invasions of sedentary peoples that combined bureaucratic skills with warrior skills, the merging of extended trade with new technologies, allow these new aggressive state systems to expand their control, extend their control over long-distance trading routes. They are particularly focused at this time on trade in precious goods, spices from the East, silver from the Americas, silk from Asia. Although some of the trading empires, such as the Ottoman and the Mughal Empire, saw themselves as creating environments of stability in which traders from a variety of regions could trade freely on the payment of a tax, the European empires, as they expanded, such as the Portuguese and the British and the Spanish, sought instead to create monopolistic systems, to restrict trade, to control it and benefit that way by having monopolistic control over precious goods like spices, the Portuguese, or monopolistic control over trade with a region, such as the British Empire in North America. So we get two very different courses of action among the new trading empires, with the Europeans in particular geared towards the idea of creating monopolistic control. This is clearly an early part of what we call globalization, linking the world through long-distance ocean trade. This was a key impact of the new trading empires. They fused both the dynamic profitability of long-distance trade with the stability of peasant tribute. Ottoman Empire typified this kind of system. The old system based on peasants paying taxes combined with a new dynamic growth of international trade that would speed the process of growing imperial power. Empires were now going to achieve a degree of power and reach of influence never even imagined in past centuries. On the downside, that growth means disparities of wealth. The winners are the rulers of these new trading empires. The losers will be those people who are exploited by this new system, people who are left out from the monopolistic systems. And of course, there is the other danger of pandemic, of epidemic disease spreading across vast territories. Finally, there is also rapid social change taking place, as we saw in North America and we will see in other instances. Social and economic changes are rapidly accelerating. New kinds of formations, as we saw as with the Dakota Indians. That's just the beginning. A new world order is being born out of this process. And we will begin looking at that more closely next time as we look at the Spanish Empire.